have Wesla Whitfield, Mike Greensill, John Watala. They are performing tonight with another person who Wesla will introduce. And if you're interested, the person that she will introduce has some books for sale, okay? And it's a plug, but I have read almost all of the Peggy Lee book, and it's absolutely outstanding. So if you're so inclined, we have books and we have CDs of Wesla available after the show. Okay? At this point in time, I'd like to introduce Peggy Lee Remembered and give the microphone over to Wesla.
I love the East, I love the West, and North or South, they're both the best. But I'll only go there as a guest, 'cause I love being here with you. I love the sea, I love the shore, I love the rocks, and what is more, with you there, there'd never be a bore. I love being here with you, singing in the shower, laughing by the hour. Life is such a breezy game. I love all kinds of weather as long as we're together. Love to hear you say my name. I like good wine and fine cuisine and candlelight. I dig that scene. But baby, if you know what I mean, oh, I love being here with you. I love the dance by Fred Astaire and Brando's eyes, you Ritter's hair. But I think to tell you it's only fair that I love being here with you. And Cary Grant, oh, do-da day, his other charm takes me away. But don't get me wrong, how do you say I love being here with you? Basie's band is swinging, I like Ellis singing, 'cause of something else you know. They know how to say it, they know how to play it, they wind it up and let it go. I love the thrill of New York shows, I'd love to kiss Durante's nose, but I'd like to say before I close, I love being here, I love being here, I love being here with you. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you a friend of mine, one of the more interesting people that I know in the world, who's written several fine books. Today we're here to celebrate just one of them about Peggy Lee, Mr. James Gavin.
Good afternoon, everybody. Peggy Lee. If you ever saw her perform, then you remember those eyes. Distant, mysterious, yet they pierced right through you. Peggy was the Mona Lisa of pop jazz, and she swung hard, but her singing was as much about silence as it was about sound. Peggy Lee put it this way: when I get very quiet and very intense, the power goes right through. Peggy was born in Jamestown, North Dakota in 1920. And because her father worked on the railroad, she traveled around all the time. Every town looked pretty much the same to her. North Dakota, said Peggy, was forever, and it was flat. So was her birth name, Norma Dolores Eggstrom. Life for Peggy and her family and their neighbors was a daily battle to survive. Everybody was poor. The winters were so cold that some people died. Houses burned to the ground. Norma watched it happen to two of hers. Nobody complained. That's just the way life was. And Norma learned how to keep things hidden. But that didn't mean that she wasn't feeling them intensely. She escaped into a rather bizarre fantasy life. She remembered herself as, quote, a weird little child with a tremendous imagination. She saw her life as a Cinderella story. It included Selma, her perfect angel mother who had died when she was 4 and whom she missed for the rest of her life. Her father, Marvin, drank too much to be available for any of his 7 kids. Then, of course, came the evil stepmother, Min. Min was this hulking German battle axe that Marvin had married so that somebody would look after the family. Min made Norma feel invisible, and she also had her scrubbing the floors, just like Cinderella. They did not get along well at all. And after Min died in the early 70s, Peggy Lee got her revenge by telling the world that Min was an ogre who had beat her up every day. That was fiction. But Min had given Peggy the anger to survive almost anything. Now, little Norma had a polite little singing voice, and she sang in church and in the glee club, but that kind of music didn't interest her at all. She had an epiphany in 1935 when she twisted the dial of the family's Atwater Kent radio, and out came Kansas City and Count Basie's orchestra live. This was the blues, and Peggy got it. From then on, whenever a train whistle rang out, she heard the blues, and that lonesome wail slipped into her singing. She learned about rhythm from the clip-clop of horses' hooves and from trains chugging into the station.
They say that out of sight is out of mind, that hearts forget and sometimes wonder. But since you went away, sweetheart, I find that absence makes the heart grow fonder. Waiting for the train to come in, waiting for my man to come home. I've counted every minute of each livelong day, been so melancholy since you went away. I've shed 1,000,000 teardrops or more, waiting for the man I adore. I'm waiting at the depot by the railroad track, looking for that choo-choo train that brings him back. I'm waiting for my life to begin. I'm waiting for the train to come in. Jealous. Shed a million teardrops or more, waiting for the one I adore. I'm waiting at the depot by the railroad track. I'm looking for that choo-choo train that brings him back. I'm waiting for my life to begin. I am waiting for the train to come in.
Peggy got jobs singing on the radio all over North Dakota, but she wanted out of that place and as far away from Min as she could possibly get. In 1941, she got a gig singing in a little cocktail lounge in Chicago, and that is where her Cinderella story came true, because in the audience was the king of swing, Benny Goodman. Benny's singer, Helen Forrest, had just quit in umbrage. She found Benny so crazy and hateful that she couldn't bear another day of it. And she said to him, "Find yourself another singer and fast." And that was Peggy Lee's lucky night. And that's how Peggy Lee joined the Benny Goodman Orchestra. Now, because of her Scandinavian reserve and because of all of the stoic quality that she had developed in her tough years in North Dakota, Peggy sang very, very softly. It was rare for a band singer to sing like that. Usually they belted over these big orchestras. But when Peggy sang, couples on the dance floor had to pull up close, even when she sang this next song. It was the song that made her a star. The year was 1943. Peggy was obsessed with this song. It was a tough, angry blues by a singer from Chicago named Lil Green. And America discovered this song because of this milky white Scandinavian blonde who had grown up in a place where there was hardly a black person in sight. "But you know," said Peggy, "I'm not really a white singer. I sing black. I always have."
You had plenty money, 1922. You let other people make a fool of you. Why don't you do right like some other men do? Get out of here and get me some money too. You're sitting down wondering what it's all about. If you ain't got no money, they will put you out. Why don't you do right like some other men do? Get out of here and get me some money too. If you had prepared 19 years ago, you wouldn't be wandering now from door to door. Why don't you do right like some other men do? Oh, get out of here and get me some money too. I fell for your jiving and I took you in. Now all you got to offer me's a drink of gin. Why don't you do right like some other men do? Get out of here and get me some money too. Why don't you do right like some other men do? Like some other men do. This is when I get to talk about Peggy. I did get to hear Peggy. It was at the Venetian Room sometime in the 70s. She was a bit ill by then, and so she came up on stage with her oxygen tank, didn't care, and sang for us for an hour and 15 minutes, which it seemed like it went by in about 5. The woman was dynamic. The woman had a way of taking all the light in the room and shining it just on her. And all you looked at was her, and all you heard was her. We loved it so much we stayed for the second show, which was exactly like the first, except it wasn't. Different audience, same songs, same singer, but a completely different image and energy. I never saw or heard anything like it since. Now, Peggy Lee fell in love. She fell in love with Dave Barbour. And this is their first hit that they wrote together. I know a little bit about a lot of things, but I don't know enough about you. Just when I think you're mine, you try a different line. But baby, what can I do? I read the latest news, no buttons on my shoes. But baby, I'm confused about you. I know a little bit about a lot of things, but I don't know enough about you. Jack of all trades and master of none. And isn't it a shame? I'm so sure that you'd be good for me if you'd only play my game. You know, I went to school and I'm nobody's fool. That is to say, until I met you. I know a little bit about a lot of things, but I don't know enough about you. Yes, sir. Jack of all trades, master of none, and isn't it a shame? I'm so sure that you'd be good for me if you'd only play my game. You know, I went to school and I'm nobody's fool. That is to say, until I met you. I know a little bit about a lot of things, but I don't know enough about you. I know a little bit about biology and a little more about psychology. I'm a little gem in geology, but I don't know enough about you.
Jack Jones was a friend of Peggy Lee's. I asked him to describe her to me, and he put it this way. Peggy was a delightful cuckoo clock. She was just out there, wistful, idealistic, had a great sense of humor. By the end of World War II, Peggy was an all-American princess, and she had found her Prince Charming in the Benny Goodman Band. As Wesla mentioned, Dave Barber, a beautiful guitar player, a poet of the guitar strings. He was Italian, tall, good-looking, a wisecracker, great guy. But Peggy sensed a sadness in Dave that attracted her. Like her father, Dave drank a lot, and Peggy was hooked. She had gotten pregnant, and they had left Benny Goodman and eloped. Their enchanted castle was a seedy little rented house in Hollywood. Now, for about a year, housewife and Mama Peggy was content. Then she got bored. She tried her hand at writing lyrics, and Dave would set them to music as a little matrimonial parlor game. Now, not far from them was a little startup mom-and-pop record label called Capitol Records. And Capitol and their executives coaxed Peggy and Dave into recording, and that's what got Peggy back into the business and made her a singer-songwriter before the term existed. That song, I Don't Know Enough About You, was their first big hit. But there were others. There was a song you may remember, a #1 hit for 10 weeks in 1948 called Mañana, a wildly un-PC spoof of Lazy Mexicans. Another one of their big records was a song called It's a Good Day that was a welcoming back of the troops and a return to normalcy after World War II had ended. It was Peggy's promise to everyone that the future was going to be greater than ever. But as Dave sank into the role of Mr. Peggy Lee, his drinking got worse and worse. In 1948, he had to have emergency surgery for ulcers. It was very, very close to the end for Dave. Peggy was in the waiting room, and she heard that Dave had died. She refused to believe it. Now, as she later explained, a huge shaft of life had appeared in front of her, and it led her to Dave's room. She followed it. When they locked eyes, Dave, said Peggy, had magically come back to life. He had not died after all, but the marriage didn't last. In 1951, Dave Barber divorced Peggy. She never got over him. A couple of years later, a columnist described Peggy Lee like this. Peggy is not the girl you'd run into at the high school prom. Her voice is more that of the girl in the smoke-filled room at a truck-line cafe or at a juke joint along a Texas highway. This is a song that Peggy loved to sing back then. She worshipped Billie Holiday, and in 1953 she made an album called Black Coffee that seemed haunted by the spirit of Lady Day. Joni Mitchell loves this album. Petula Clark calls this album My Bible. Katie Lang and Marianne Faithfull covered the title song. To sing it for you now, Wesla Whitfield.
Feeling mighty lonesome, I haven't slept a wink. I walk the floor and watch the door, and in between I drink black coffee. Love's a hand-me-down brew. I I'm talking to the shadows. 1 o'clock till 4. And Lord, how slow the moments go when all I do is pour black coffee. Since the blues caught my eye, I'm hanging out on Monday, my Sunday blues to dry. Now a man is born to go a-loving, a woman's born to weep and fret, to stay at home and tend her oven and drown her dress regrets in coffee and cigarettes. I'm mourning all the morning and mourning all the night, and in between it's nicotine and not much will to fight black coffee. Feeling low as the ground, there's waiting for my baby to maybe come around. Now a man is born to go a-loving, a woman's born to weep and fret, to stay at home and tend her oven and drown her past regrets in coffee and cigarettes. I'm mourning all the morning and mourning all the night, and in between it's nicotine and not much will to fight black coffee. Feeling low as the ground, it's driving me crazy. This waiting for my baby to maybe come around.
Peggy had come aboard Decca Records, Bing Crosby's label. Her tenure at Capitol had ended rather sourly. Peggy's sales had plunged, and Peggy was not that easy to deal with. And so the executives at Capitol Records were not heartbroken to let her go. Peggy had come to them and said that she had a new conception for the song Lover by Richard Rodgers and Lawrence Hart. And Capitol wasn't interested. They had recently had a hit version of Lover by Les Paul and Mary Ford. Peggy argued that hers was completely different. And it was like this. Latin music was the craze at that time, and Peggy had a wild, explosive arrangement that she had designed of Lover with congas and bongos and strings sawing away frantically. It had turned this maiden's love call into a cry of lust. Capitol just wasn't interested, but Decca was willing to take her on. And she recorded Lover for Decca, and she ended up with a #3 hit. It sounded nothing like the way Jeanette MacDonald had sung Lover in the movie Love Me Tonight. And the composer, Richard Rodgers, was appalled. He said publicly, "I suppose this recording is about as far as you can go in the way of distortion and still have the nerve to use the title."
You have to imagine the bongo.
Lover, when I'm near you and I hear you call my name, softly in my ears you breathe a flame. Lover, when we're dancing, keep on glancing in my eyes till love's entrance flies. All of my future is in you. You're every plan I design. Promise you'll always continue to be mine. Oh, lover, please be tender. When your tender fears depart, lover, I surrender to my heart. All of my future is in you. Your every plan I design. Promise you'll always continue to be mine. Oh, lover, please be tender. When your tender fears depart, lover, I surrender to my heart. To my heart. Lover, I surrender to my heart.
Peggy had many violently opposing different sides, and in 1955, two of them went on display on movie screens all over the United States. 1955 was the year of Walt Disney's Lady and the Tramp, and it had a half a dozen songs that Peggy had written with the composer Sonny Burke. It also had a lot of Peggy's actual voice. You heard her as the two mischievous cats who sang "We Are Siamese, If You Please." You heard her as Darling, the human mother of Lady. And she was the toothless, vamping show dog named Peg. That same year, there was Peggy in the movies playing a tortured alcoholic singer who loses her mind. Jack Webb, who had been Sergeant Joe Friday in Dragnet, was making a film about jazz and murder in 1920s New Orleans. The story included a character called Rose, a forlorn woman, the girlfriend of a gangster who beats her up. Jack Webb was producing, starring, and directing in this film, Pete Kelly's Blues. And he had in his mind the image of the perfect person to play Rose, and it was Peggy Lee. He sent her the script, and it scared her. It was so close to home, because Peggy drank a lot herself, and the darkness of that character resonated with Peggy. In the film, after her boyfriend, this gangster, has thrown her down a staircase, Rose ends up in an insane asylum. And that's where she murmurs this strange, childlike little song.
Red and yellow and pink and green, purple and orange and blue. I can sing a rainbow, sing a rainbow, sing a rainbow too. Listen with your eyes, listen with your eyes and sing everything you see. You can sing a rainbow, sing a rainbow, sing along with me. Red and yellow and pink and green, purple and orange and blue. Now we can sing a rainbow, sing a rainbow, sing a rainbow too. Listen with your eyes, listen with your eyes and sing everything you see. You can sing a rainbow, sing a rainbow, sing along with me. Red and yellow and pink and green, purple and orange and blue. Now we can sing a rainbow, sing a rainbow, sing a rainbow too.
The next year, 1956, there was a hot, nasty single playing on black jukeboxes. This song was all about sexual obsession. The singer was an 18-year-old from Arkansas who called himself Little Willie John. And this record caught a lot of what was terrifying white middle-class American parents of the 1950s about the youth generation run amok. After Little Willie John, a white teenager from Texas named Ray Peterson recorded it, and his version was a jungle of bongos and horns and snapping fingers and the sexy wailing of this young boy singer. The song was called Fever. Peggy's bass player, Max Bennett, had brought it to her, and she loved it, but she wondered, what can I possibly do with this song to make it my own? Then she remembered her personal motto, which she had borrowed from Earl Warren, who was the Chief Justice of the United States. Yes, Earl Warren had said, this is quite profound, I think, the eternal struggle of art is to leave out all but the essentials. There you have the Peggy Lee story in one line. So instead of all that thick orchestration and steamy atmosphere, Peggy thought of just using snapping fingers, a little bit of percussion, and bass. She was working with a lyricist at the time named Sid Culler, who wrote special material for her nightclub act. And Sid Culler suggested that she, personally, write some new stanzas about historical figures who had the fever, such as Captain Smith and Pocahontas and Romeo and Juliet. She and Sid wrote these stanzas together, and they recorded this song in 1958. To this day, that classic record, which has been covered by Elvis Presley, Madonna, Beyonce, and a host of others, defines cool. In Peggy Lee's dictionary, cool was all about what you left unsaid.
Never know how much I love you. Never know how much I care. When you put your arms around me, I get a fever that's so hard to bear. You give me fever. When you kiss me, fever when you hold me tight. Fever in the morning, fever all through the night. Sun lights up the daytime, moon lights up the night. I light up when you call my name, and you know I'm gonna treat you right. You give me fever when you kiss me, fever when you hold me tight. Fever in the morning and fever all through the night. Everybody's got the fever. That is something you all know. Fever isn't such a new thing. Fever started long ago. Romeo loved Juliet. Juliet, she felt the same. When he put his arms around her, he said, Julie, baby, you're my flame, now give us fever. When you kiss me, fever with thy flaming youth. Fever, I'm on fire. Fever, yea, I burn forsooth. Captain Smith and Pocahontas had a very mad affair. When her daddy tried to kill him, she said, Daddy, oh, don't you dare. He gives me fever with his kisses, fever when he holds me tight. Fever, I'm his missus. Oh, Daddy, won't you treat him right? Now you've listened to my story. Here's the point that I have made. Chicks were born to give you fever, be it Fahrenheit or centigrade, they give you fever. When you kiss them, fever if you live and learn. Fever till you sizzle, what a lovely way to burn. What a lovely way to burn. What a lovely
January of 1961, it was almost 0 degrees in Manhattan. But inside Basin Street East, wrote the New York Times, it was sizzling. Why? Because Peggy Lee was there. For older, worldlier New Yorkers, that supper club on the East Side was a dream combination of chic and hip. Basin Street East welcomed the aristocrats of the jazz world: Ella, Sarah, Duke, Buddy Rich. In this club, rock and folk music did not exist. Brooks Brothers suits and cocktail dresses were the style. Swing was king and Peggy Lee was queen. One of her conductors, Mike Melvoin, remembered that club this way. Back then, you'd go out and say, "Where are the nightclubs we see in the movies?" Then you'd go to Basin Street East, and here it was. Peggy would arrive with productions of balletic complexity. Her shows were orchestrated to the hilt, not only musically, but in their abundance of lighting cues, hand gestures, eye movements, and scripted remarks. Peggy couldn't read a note of music, but she knew exactly what she wanted to hear, even if she had odd ways of expressing it. She would say to her conductor, "I'd like to hear feathers." She told her piano player, Lou Levy, "I'd like it to be like a cloud." By now, Peggy Lee had a true saloon voice. It was rough around the edges. It was the sound of cigarettes, liquor, late nights, a frequently broken heart, and a never-say-die party spirit. Hours before a show, she would sit at the makeup table with a cigarette burning in an ashtray beside her and create the face and hair that audiences knew as Peggy Lee's. She was racked with fear. Almost everything in her shows went right, but there was so much that could also go wrong. To her friend Phoebe Jacobs, Peggy wouldn't have had it any other way. Peggy, said Phoebe, enjoyed every bit of anxiety, every bit of pain. Nobody forced her to do this. If she wanted to get herself a little whacked out because she wanted to be more perfect than perfect, so be it. Just before showtime, this nightly ritual began. A mandatory gathering of all the musicians and selected other insiders in Peggy's dressing room. Said Phoebe, we got together and prayed that all would go well. It was silent and intense, and we would hold hands. Peggy kissed everyone in turn, then murmured a mantra she had devised for each person. Power, burn, lima beans. She clutched one man's wrist, stared into his eyes, and demanded, say it with me, straight up, straight ahead, and strong. Straight up, straight ahead, and strong. Nothing gave Peggy as much energy or comfort as anger. One friend recalled watching Peggy place a drinking glass dangerously close to the edge of her dressing table. Then she asked a guest to reach over and hand her something that was on the other side of the table. Inevitably, the glass got pushed off and shattered on the floor. The rage would make Peggy's hazel eyes turn black. Out in the showroom, you'd see Joan Crawford, Ava Gardner, Cary Grant, Lena Horne, Sinatra, Garland, Dietrich. Everyone waited and waited for the arrival of the so-called perfectionist. Miss Lee is late, observed a reporter. She is always late. She has a chronic fear of failure, and when the time comes to perform, she stalls. The overture began. Peggy stood trembling in her beaded dress behind a little curtain to the left of the stage. Then came the announcement. And now, Basin Street East proudly presents Miss Peggy Lee. She downed a glass of cognac in one gulp and forced herself onto the stage. The ovation and the spotlight hit her, and she glowed like some celestial creature. On her face was the cool smile of a sphinx ready to devour her prey.
The minute you walked in the joint, I could see you were a man of distinction, a real big spender, good looking, so refined. Say, wouldn't you like to know what's going on in my mind? So let me get right to the point. I don't pop my cork for every guy I see. Hey, big spender, spend a little time with me. Wouldn't you like to have fun, fun, fun? How's about a few laughs, laughs? I can show you a good time. Let me show you a good time. The minute you walked in the joint, I could see you were a man of distinction, a real big spender, good looking, so refined. Say, wouldn't you like to know what's going on in my mind? So let me get right to the point. I don't pop my cork for every guy I see. Hey, big spender. Hey, big spender. Hey, big spender. Spend a little time with me. Spend a little time with me.
The 1960s were very exciting years for Peggy Lee. She toured the country with a big entourage and dozens of trunks, gowns, and gowns, and she put on these expensive orchestral shows. No matter what, she looked cool, controlled, and sexy on stage. But if you went backstage and entered the dressing room, you would see an oxygen tank and a star who seemed quite fragile. Peggy might very well invite you to keep her company, and sometimes, if you did, you would be there with her until dawn. Peggy had had a fourth and final marriage to a bongo player from Argentina. It lasted for 3 months. After that, she hired a young guitar player named Steve Blum. Steve Blum was 18 years old at the time, but she seemed to see him as her new Dave Barber. Even at that age, Steve sensed an emptiness in Peggy that seemed beyond filling. As Steve said, she had to have people around her, and when the party was over, I think she was afraid to be alone. Peggy had gone back some years earlier to Capitol Records, but things were not going well for her there. She kept turning out at least 2 albums a year with top musicians, many beautiful albums, but now her competition in the marketplace was the Beatles and the Beach Boys. Peggy was one of the label's dinosaurs. And by 1968, the new young executives at Capitol were ready to drop her. That year, she received a demo of new songs by Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller, the great songwriting team who had written a hit for her called I'm a Woman, as well as Hound Dog, Jailhouse Rock, Stand By Me, many big rock and roll and R&B hits. There was a song on this tape unlike anything they had ever written before, and it riveted Peggy. It was a mostly spoken monologue with a circus rhythm, oom-pa, rather like Bertolt Brecht and Kurt Weill, in fact. The words were based on the short story Disillusionment by Thomas Mann. This song had scared off Marlene Dietrich, who was the first choice of Lieber and Stoller to sing it. So they sent it to Peggy Lee as a sort of afterthought. Peggy heard it and she said, I've lived that whole thing. She had to record this. She insisted that they give it to nobody else. She said to Lieber and Stoller, if you give this song to anybody else, it's over. Jerry Lieber said, what's over? She said, everything. So in January of 1969, Capitol Records let her do it. This recording session brought together a faded singing star, two by now has-been rock and roll songwriters, and a young arranger who had made one flop album of original songs. Peggy was fascinated by him. His name was Randy Newman. Yeah, Capitol heard this, and they had no intention of ever releasing this record. They thought that it was depressing and much too long. But Peggy was absolutely certain that this song was her salvation, and she plotted ways to force Capitol to put it out.